Oh, hello, Nancy. Welcome. Did you have a good retreat?
Yes, I'd have. It's been wonderful, and one of the best parts was reviewing the Edinger book on the Christian archetype.
Oh, good. I'm glad you like that. Um, I see you on the YouTube, but I do not see Miles, who's also supposedly here. And he went away, I think, momentarily. Um, so Tim has had some good interaction with you, he told me.
Yes.
And I said to him, maybe what he was talking with you about, we won't talk about it here, but maybe that would be um, the sign you were looking for to complete uh, complete interview number 5.
We'll see.
Good evening, Jerome. Welcome.
Hey, how you doing, Skip?
Well,
From
we're here, and we have a few people on YouTube. I'm just trying to set it up in a way that I can see. Okay, so we were going to talk tonight about the Christian archetype, but before we get into that, I want to give others a little bit of a chance to get to join us. And I wanted to, first of all, comment on, let's see, share my brochure. So let me do that for those that don't know, I know you folks know, but others don't. So I'm going to just share this for a minute. So Skip is going to give a special lecture on next Sunday at 2 p.m. entitled Finding the Living God. And this will be at Unity by the Bay in Annapolis, Maryland. And it's co-sponsored by a community of transformation called ACT in Annapolis. And I'll be talking about various religious experiences that I've had in my lifetime with a view to helping you be sensitive to the ones that happen to you, because I'm convinced that they happen to everyone, and we're just not sensitive enough to see them. So I'm just going to scroll by so you can take a look at that at your leisure on the playback. And so much, that's the end of my advertisement for the night. But I've been looking for months. I remember this quote that I want to read, and I had forgotten where it was, and where it is in this book. It's called C.G. Jung Psychological Reflections, and it's edited by Yolanda Jacobi and R.F.C. Hall, who were two very close collaborators with Dr. Jung. And there's a section in this book entitled The Way to God. And I was remembering this quote, but I couldn't remember where it was. And I have another anthology of Jung quotes, and I kept looking in there for it, never could find it. It's because it's the first thing on The Way to God in this book. And so I just want to read it to you. It comes from an essay entitled The State of Psychology Today, which is found in Collected Works, Volume 10, which is Civilization in Transition. Here's the quote. For thousands of years, the mind of man has worried about the sick soul, perhaps even earlier than it did about the sick body. The propitiation of gods, the perils of the soul, and its salvation, these are not yesterday's problems. Religions are psychotherapeutic systems in the truest sense of the word, and on the grandest scale. They express the whole range of the psychic problem in mighty images. They are the avowal and recognition of the soul, and at the same time, the revelation of the soul's nature. From this universal foundation, no human soul is cut off. Only the individual consciousness that has lost its connection with the psychic totality remains caught in the illusion that the soul is a small, circumscribed area, a fit subject for scientific theorizing. The loss of this great relationship is the prime evil of neurosis. And so I've been wanting to share that with Paul Vanderklay, among others, because when I mentioned to him that he was in the same business as psychologists, he seemed surprised when I said that. And so I wanted to share that one with him. And so obviously there are huge parallels. And if you're a listener to this live stream and have a chance, please look at the interviews that I've done with Nancy Pfaff, who's with us tonight. She's done a series of interviews with me on Christian individuation, and these are very powerful interviews. And the first 3 of them are posted. I have a 4th one that I'm still editing, and there'll be a 5th one. We're promised by Nancy. So anyway, Nancy's with us here tonight, so feel free to ask her anything in the comments. Buddha's breath says, happens to me every day and every dream. I'm not sure what he's referring to, but he says, I think the Red Book makes the unconscious into conscious by connecting the guilty conscience. Yeah, or the guilty conscious. Yep, I think there's something to that, certainly. Okay, so tonight we're going to have a little bit of a discussion about this book, which I've been reading into the YouTube channel. And so far I've read 7 of the chapters. The last 2, chapters 6 and 7, it's called The Christian Archetype, a Jungian Commentary on the Life of Christ by Edward F. Edinger. It's published by Inner City Books. And just to mention, there are, I think, 8 now videos of me reading up through chapter 7. Tonight we're going to comment on the first, those 8, and then you can go hear me read it to you if you like. Unfortunately, I did the first 5 in live stream, so I did not edit them. And I'm in the process of editing them. I've gotten number 4 completed just now, so I'll be posting that soon, but I'll be giving you the links to all the chapters in all of the video descriptions within a few days. It's a big task. So anyway,
Skip,
go ahead.
I've got a slide here just to show your list. If
okay,
your
great.
playlist, if you want to see it.
That's great. And
okay, can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so you can see that if you go to Skip's channel and just go to the playlists, you'll find a playlist called The Christian Archetype, Jungian Commentary on the Life of Christ. And they're all in order here, where he's reading from Edinger's book. And as he's up to 8 now, and so the next time he reads, he'll be up to 9 and 10.
Right.
And this is a good way to find out, because this is in the order of Edinger's book.
Right. And
by chapter, actually.
And as soon as you release my screen, I'm going to.
Okay, I did.
Or I'm sorry, it's not that.
Oh, okay.
It's not you. It's this. I'm going to put the link on the YouTube chat now. So this is Skip's playlist, and here's the. That's the link to the playlist. Good evening, Craig. Welcome. We're just getting rolling. I don't know if he hears us.
Yes, I hear you.
Okay.
I just got on. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah, I don't see. Oh, here I can mute. I'm going to mute for.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. It will be better if you don't cut off the top of your head in the image.
Oh, all right. Okay. All right. Yeah, I found if you sign up right from Zoom and not from your link, it works better. Oops.
Yeah, I found the same thing. You just put the code in Zoom.
Yeah, and then it goes right to. All right, let's see if I can get this. I guess I've been this way. Well,
right. Okay, so meanwhile, I'm going to share my screen because I've created some pages here that just relate to the introductory quotes from the various chapters of this book. And that'll help the people that are outside the webinar group to understand what it is we're talking about. So I'm going to share the first of these pages now. And yes, it would be good if everyone in the webinar will mute themselves so that we don't get a lot of extraneous sound. Okay, but this is the first part of it. And on the frontispiece, it says, what happens in the life of Christ happens always and everywhere. In the Christian archetype, all lives of this kind are prefigured. And this is from C.G. Jung's Psychology and Religion, which is volume 11 of the collected works. Now, the intro to the introduction to the book includes this. The drama of the archetype of the life of Christ describes in symbolic images the events in the conscious life, as well as in the life that transcends consciousness, of a man who has been transformed by his higher destiny. And that's from A Psychological Approach to the Trinity, Psychology and Religion, collected works 11, paragraph 233. And then there's this further quote. Insofar as the archetypal content of the Christian drama was able to give satisfying expression to the uneasy and clamorous unconscious of the many, the consensus, okay, I have it printed out here, so it's a little easier for me to read from the printout instead of from the screen. The consensus omnium raised this drama to a universally binding truth, not of course by an act of judgment, but by the irrational fact of possession, which is far more effective. Thus Jesus became the tutelary image or amulet against the archetypal powers that threaten to possess everyone. The glad tidings announced, quote, it has happened, but it will not happen to you inasmuch as you believe in Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Yet it could, and it can, and it will happen to everyone in whom the Christian dominant has decayed. For this reason, there have always been people who, not satisfied with the dominance of conscious life, set forth under cover and by devious paths to their destruction or salvation to seek direct experience of the eternal roots, and following the lure of the restless unconscious psyche, find themselves in the wilderness where, like Jesus, they come up against the son of darkness. Okay, so that's an ominous quote. And now I'm going to share with you the Christian incarnation cycle so that everybody can be cognizant of that as well. And that also appears in the introduction of this book. And so here you see a 12-step process in the incarnation cycle. Are you seeing? Yeah, I guess you are. Okay, so the first steps are 1, the Annunciation, which is a religious experience that tells someone that the Holy Spirit is doing something. Second, the nativity, the birth of Christ. Third, the flight into Egypt. Fourth, the baptism. Fifth, the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Six, the Last Supper. Seven, Gethsemane, the garden where Jesus spent the last night of his life. And so those are the chapters that we'll be discussing tonight. And then probably next Monday, a week from tomorrow, we'll be discussing Arrest and Trial, 8, Flagellation and Mocking, 9, Crucifixion, 10, Lamentation and Entombment, 11, and Resurrection and Ascension, 12. Then the cycle begins again. So Pentecost, which is number 13, is actually, again, the Holy Spirit coming down, this time in the form of Christ appearing to his disciples after the crucifixion, when Thomas puts his hand in the wound, and among other things that happen on the Pentecost. And that's considered the birthday of the church. And so now the church has been going through the same cycle since the Pentecost. But this book is about the life of Christ, actually. It's not about the life of the church. Okay, so that's the opener. Any comments there? What would you like to say about it, panelists, so far?
Well, those were very powerful quotes. You know, the one thing I like about this book is it's so exciting, every single chapter, because it it relates the inner drama. Well, one thing it says is that these 14 or 13, and if you include the Assumption of Mary, is the vicissitudes of the self, or the changes in the self through the various stages. But at the same time, it is also can be the changes in the ego in the process of individuation. So how do these 13 steps relate to the individual in their process of dialoguing with their own inner self, getting the image, and then creating the symbol, which is the child. You know, that's right. The birth.
Okay, and
the birth.
So keeping in mind now, we have a lot of laymen that may be watching this particular video, because this is not the advanced group. And so let us talk about a little bit about the symbol and the image, in the sense that, and please chime in here, but the 2 million year old man, as Jung referred to it, but it's actually the 3.5 billion year old instinctual man, is the deep unconscious. And that man has kept us, or that man or woman has kept all of our ancestors alive until they reproduce successfully. And then it keeps us alive even after we've reproduced, of course. And it communicates to us through images, because its communication was developed before humans developed language. So it speaks to us in images, and that's why we have dreams and visions. And it's that part of us that's communicating with us from a depth psychology point of view. And so would anybody else like to?
Yes, Skip. I was thinking the first step in this thing is enunciation, and Edinger put it quite well, as he said, analysis should release an experience that grips us or falls upon us as from above, an experience that has substance and body, such as those things which occurred to the ancients. And if he were going to summarize this, we'd call it the enunciation. So what happens is you feel seized by something, and you need to be able to bring that forward and to release that experience that's gripping you.
Right. Okay. So
that's
you jumped ahead a little bit, but that's okay.
Well, you were talking about the ancient things that are within us, in other words.
Right. So the point is we have religious experiences, and that's what the point of my talk is a week from today.
Yeah, and they grip you is what.
Yeah, they grab you and they change your attitude entirely. Right. And so then, as Jerome rightly says, this is the opening phase, which is the Annunciation, the first chapter. It's a religious experience, and Dr. Jung is talking about it in terms of an analysis. And he says analysis should release an experience that grips us or falls upon us as from above, an experience that has substance and body, such as those which occurred to the ancients. If I were going to symbolize it, I would choose the Annunciation. And certainly the experiences that I have had have been of that flavor. And I mean, I haven't been told I was going to deliver the Son of God, but I've had a lot of other experiences.
Don't you think that's a very surprising conclusion at the end of that statement? Every time I read it, it shocks me. It's such a beautiful and unexpected image.
That he would choose the Annunciation?
Yes. I mean, when you hear it, I mean, I've never, I mean, that comes from the 1925 seminars where he's actually going through and talking about his own spiritual history up until that point. A lot of his students in analysis would you tell us your story? So that's his story, the notes of the seminars of 1925. But every time I hear that, it is a shock, because it is just, no one but Jung would have said that.
Well, yes. And obviously this is why Edinger thought he was so brilliant. But I think we have to defer a moment to Nancy here, because she's the only woman in the panel at the moment. And she happens to be a mother. And so it occurred to me earlier today that the Annunciation is somewhat like the experience of learning that you're going to be a mother, and suddenly, wow, your life has changed. You know, whether it's the Son of God that you're going to deliver or just a baby, any woman who learns that she's about to become a mother and she's now possessed by the mother archetype. But let me defer to Nancy. Nancy, would you comment?
I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but
well, I'm saying that it's kind of a religious experience to learn that.
Well, you certainly feel it as your natural life. What you were born to be, you are. Mm-hmm. You are carrying new life. You're going to bring forth a new human being into the world. So there is a lot of joy there once you get past the morning sickness, and you know, preparing, setting up the nursery and so forth. It's a sense of being in the right place at the right time, doing what you were born to do.
Right.
Can you apply that, the feeling of knowing that you're now carrying a child, to the statement that Jung says that the ego is the manger where the Christ child is born? In other words, the psychological meaning of the Annunciation is that within our ego a spiritual being is going to come into existence. So I mean, it's
Right.
it's
And
supposed to be analogous to the physical child.
Craig is
What-
jumping ahead to chapter 2. The
Oh, I didn't
nativity.
mean to. I was the
Okay.
Annunciation. Is
So-
the well? I didn't. I was sort of just saying that the Annunciation is the announcement that you're going to have a child. Like,
Right.
say you just found out that you were pregnant,
Right.
you know, and so now what is the analogy to that happening in the psyche? You know, you're a woman, and you have just learned that you're going to bear a physical child. You are an ego, and you now have an annunciation through your analysis, something that grips you and possesses you,
Mhm.
which is supposed to be analogous to Annunciation.
Right. Okay.
It would
So
seem to me that my conversion to Christ was very much like that, praying and inviting the Holy Spirit in, and then experiencing a whole new life, a real surrender to Christ. There would be the ego surrendering to the self.
mhm.
And it was a full body, full psyche experience.
Right.
Yeah,
And I
Jung.
think,
Yeah, go ahead.
I
I'm
was
sorry.
just going to say, I think it would be something analogous to the Annunciation,
Mhm.
because something I became something different. I was not just who I was before. There was someone else there.
Mhm.
What does Mary tell Gabriel when he announces this to her?
I don't know.
He says, "I am the handmaid and the servant of the Lord." In other
Right.
words,
Okay.
she is becoming the servant of the Lord. And this is contrasted to Eve and her, assent to the serpent, So, I mean, Eve had a similar, annunciation from the serpent in the Garden of Eden. And Mary gets one from the angel of Gabriel, and her response was that she is obedient. She's soul's acceptance, subordinate slavery, servitude to the self. I mean, that's what Mary's response was to the announcement or the Annunciation from Gabriel. And then this is supposed to be somewhat analogous to Eve being obedient to the suggestion of the serpent in the garden, and then so instead of from her, for in Adam all die, and for in Christ all live. I mean, it is set like what you were talking about, Nancy. I think is this ego surrender, and one thing that always has, this is supposed to be second of the half of life stuff after you're older. One thing that Linda Fears David said one time, that in her analysans back in the 20s, before they had birth control or something, whenever a woman would get in a deep depression, she thought that the way to get out of the depression would be to have another physical child, where Linda suggested to him, no, you don't need another physical child. You need to create your moon child. And in other words, you need to bring forth the child of the psyche.
Right.
Yeah. And
right. Okay, well, I think we should refer back to our chatters that are online here. And so let me offer a few of the comments that they're giving and open it up for discussion. First of all, Buddha's Breath says, he's asking me if I'm referring to myself in the third person. And I don't know, sometimes I do, I suppose. I am not a Christian, but I have been bearing the cross. No one to hear my lament. Well, I think that there are lots of people out there, both in Buddhism and Christianity, that can hear your lament. not to mention psychotherapists and Jungian analysts. So, and at least the ones in the religious side are no charge, I believe. And Zachary Fisher says, why would the temptation not be in those steps? Well, the temptation is certainly mentioned and covered in, I believe it's in chapter 4 of the book, but I can't say because it was Edinger that was writing the book, so I don't know why.
It's covered. It is covered, but it's not listed as a step.
Right. It's covered in the book, but it's not listed as a unique step. But it is an important aspect of one of these chapters.
Well,
so
could there be temptation in any of the steps to take, to not go ahead with it? In other words,
surely.
Doubts.
Doubts and fears, right, and everything, and you backtrack.
Right.
You don't go forward with the step.
You get in there, and the first thing you meet is manifest evil. And, the Jungian analysts, including Anne Belford Ulanoff, commented that when you begin a Jungian style analysis, the first thing you meet is your evil side, which is in the shadow. And most people are not conscious of it. And, that can be quite surprising. And so it's best to be aware of it. And so Buddha's breath here says, the experience is what schizophrenics go through, the unity of the feminine and masculine in the psyche. And then he says, I take refuge in you, from you. Well, good grief. Nobody's taking refuge in me. I don't know about the rest of you folks, but...
Well, the one thing about analysis, Jungian analysis, which is a little bit different, is the idea now is that the ego is the rescuer or the redeemer of all analysis is to rescue the imprisoned or neglected soul and bring it into consciousness. So, the idea of Jungian analysis is a redemption, but it's the redemption of our soul, not it's the redemption of that part of us that's trapped in matter or trapped in the depths,
right.
And it's the only thing I'm saying is that it is very much linked to the Christian myth. This is what Jung's criticism of the Eastern religions were not that he had any criticism of the Eastern religion. He says, but if you were born in Europe and then you suddenly say, now I'm a Buddhist, you can be a Buddhist on the outside, but you're never going to change that you're a Christian on the inside, in the deepest depths. So that's why this Christian myth is so important to us. Everything in alchemy, again, links to the Christian myth.
Right. But my observation, and actually what Edinger explicitly says somewhere here, and he also says it in his other book, he has another book which I'll be working with in the coming months, which is the Bible and the Psyche, the individuation symbolism in the Old Testament. But basically what they're saying is these events occur in the psyche of everyone, okay? And it so happens that Christianity developed a system around these events. Other religions may have developed their system in a different way, okay? I can't say about that. Certainly I know that I've been practicing certain aspects of Buddhism for the last 25 years, and really since 1962 in a way. And I can say that certainly meditation is a valuable thing to me from Buddhism, but I do agree that, in my upbringing, I'm fundamentally a Christian because I learned the steps through Christianity first, coming up as a child. And
whether you consciously admit it or not, you're a Christian in the depths. I mean, that's what Jung's opinion is. I mean, if you were born in Europe,
right.
In European culture.
But what I'm saying is that Edinger is expanding on that to say that whether you consciously know it or not, even if you're a Hindu or a Jain or a Shintoist, you also go through these psychological steps, and they may play out differently, but they're very, very common. They're very analogous in all religions. That's basically what he was saying.
Some more interesting. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I think, okay. I lost my train of thought just because of the interruption. Anyway.
I'm sorry.
You need to mute your mic because it's if it's coming through each time, I'd appreciate it because it's going to be on the video, the noise. Anyway, what I was saying, it's important that these channels run deep and based on your particular heritage and background.
Right.
And your particular influence over the years from your forefathers. And eventually in the analysis process, you're going to have to get down to those deep roots from your heritage, and you're going to have to deal with those. You can deal with some of the surface stuff, but eventually you're going to get down to what's unique in your particular background. And, we are religious and come from that, and particularly in the United States, we're are from a Christian background, and that's our social structure.
That was what he says when he says those who set forth under cover and by devious path to seek out the direct experience of the eternal roots. And for us, it's the Christian myth.
That's right. Yeah.
Right.
There's
but it's also, in fairness, let's also comment that Dr. Edinger was talking about the Old Testament, which is Jewish, and it's also Muslim, because many aspects of the Old Testament, and including the Christ story, do appear in the Quran.
The religions of the book. The religions of the book.
The Abrahamic religions, you could classify that.
Right. So I want to be careful to.
I'll chime in with a perspective as well.
Go ahead, Max.
Pardon me. Excuse me. So for the person that said, what were they saying, that they found you to be their redeemer or something? The previous YouTube comment.
Yeah, Buddha's breath says, I take refuge in you, from you, which is something that a Buddhist might say to a Rinpoche or something like that. And I'm not certainly.
But
I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm not.
You're the Sangha. I take refuge in the Sangha. And what is it? There's three things you take.
No, the Sangha, the Dharma, and the Buddha. And
well, what I'd like to say is that, indeed, I identify with that person because, in a sense, I take refuge in you as I'm a disciple of you, and indeed, I'm a disciple of all the other panelists. And now I actually prefer to say that I'm a disciple of Christ as opposed to saying I'm a Christian. And that's very much related to that document I shared with you. For everybody who's Buddhist or Jewish, and this is Vatican Council II, where I didn't know this, but the centuries of the what is here in, I guess, Latin, the dogma of the Catholic Church was extra ecclesiam nulla solus, which translates to outside the church, there is no salvation, for many long centuries remained as a clear reminder that non-Christian people were doomed and damned. And what this is basically saying is really worth downloading. It's saying they actually backtrack on that and say that they're not going to discount that salvation is possible through other religions that are non-Christian.
Right. So Miles, would you share the link to that on the YouTube chat so others?
Yes. And just for completeness, for anybody who's listening, you can get this at ResearchGate. It's a document written by Christopher Richard Mazwahinga of Andrews University. Very well written, easy to read. And I found it really staggering because I've shared this story that is still, for the longest time, I grappled with an event where I was on my way to the playground. It must have been on a Sunday. I'm maybe 6 years old or so, and encounter a little girl who says, "Where are you going?" I say, "I'm going to the playground." And she says, "Well, we're going to church. Don't you go to church? Aren't you baptized?" And I said, "No, I guess not." And no. And she said, "Well, you're going to hell." So this for me is really powerful stuff. Obviously, that little girl never got a copy of Vatican II. So anyway, I will put the link up there.
Yeah, put the link on the chat. And meanwhile, Buddha's Breath says, the quote, "I seek refuge in you from you," is a quote of Mary, or Mariam, Mary, said to the angel Gabriel. Okay, I wasn't familiar with that, but it's almost word for word what is used in Buddhism when you're seeking, you go for refuge with a guru or a Rinpoche. So I just want to be careful about the distinction here.
One thing they mention in this chapter, which you bring up about the Old Testament, that's really interesting, is who's announcing to Mary this? It's the angel Gabriel, which Edinger calls the cloud of Yahweh, and there was some early church fathers who referred to her as the holy tabernacle, the moving temple, as Solomon's temple, the sanctuary prepared for me. That's what God said about Mary. And this is Yahweh. Yahweh is calling her the sanctuary prepared for me, the hall of the incarnation. So this is wholly about incarnating, emptying yourself of the divine, or God emptying himself of the divine and becoming human. And then she is the pure chamber of my generation. Now that is the most psychological of the statements. Although, Jung told one person is that to live as if you are a moving tabernacle. I mean, you need to represent the temple of the divine everywhere you go. But anyway, the pure chamber of my generation is what they called Mary. Speak into the ears of my rational ark. It's just this image of the vessel of the incarnation is in its early stages. Again, this is describing what he calls earlier the 13 vicissitudes of the self, the changing nature of the self at each one of the 13 stops.
Yeah. Okay. Zacharias says, the baptism of the Holy Spirit is a very real experience. The joy and satisfaction cannot be matched by any pharmaceutical. Every time it happens, it is through faith in a Bible story. It happens through the experience of the word, the living that gives meaning to the words. And of course, Nancy did have a extensive discussion with me about the baptism of the Holy Spirit. I think in our second interview, wasn't it, Nancy? I think it was the part 2 of our series.
I'm not sure which one it was, but I agree with this writer that
Yes.
it is an experience that opens you up to the numinous, and you are without doubt that there is another that you are connected to.
Right. Okay, and so Buddha's breath also says, he says, the Christian theme of God sacrificing his son is also the underlying theme of the Quran. And certainly, you know, that would be true because a very large part of the beginning of the Quran is, you know, the traditions of the Old Testament to include the story of Christ. And so that's very much there and present in the Quran, and keeping in mind that the prophet, peace be upon him, didn't have his visions until 638 or 640 AD, so 640 years after the time of Christ. And so all the people who are now Muslim, their ancestors were still worshiping in these Old Testament and New Testament ways right up until the time of the prophet, peace be upon him. And so, and certainly Jesus Christ is considered a prophet in Islam. So going on, Zachary says, take refuge in God to have refuge from the wrath. And Buddha's breath says, refuge from doubts, apparition and illusion. And very close to the concept of Amun, the hidden one in Egyptian myth. And then Miles has provided us with the quotation or the link to the Vatican II piece he brought to our attention. I think that one of the points that Edinger is making here is that the story of Christ and the story of this cycle of individuation as it came up in the Old Testament as well is basically a protection against the untrammeled flow of the archetypes from the self. And if you're possessed by one of those archetypes, if you're not protected by a religion, because as Edinger says, you fall out of containment, or you're not convinced by the dominance of the religion, then you can have these direct experiences. If you're a very faithful Christian and church-going Christian, the rituals and so on are going to protect you from the fire hose of the self. But if you're not protected by those, by religion, then what happens is you can constellate an archetype, which is what happened to me in 1993. And once that starts flowing, there's no stopping it until it's played through, and it plays through completely and thoroughly. And that was my 8-month experience in 1993 that happened to me. And so I know the truth of what he's saying here. So,
Skip, I have a comment. So for myself, I agree with what you're saying. It is important to read scripture or holy books. So I did that. I read the New Testament, but I've been pushed from pillar to post insofar as religions. But nevertheless, I did read the New Testament and I felt it speaking to me. So am I a religion unto myself?
Well, I think Thomas More would say that we each need to develop our own religion, a religion of our own. Okay, he was a Jungian analyst, and he had been almost a priest, but he didn't become a priest, but then became a Jungian analyst and an excellent writer. And one of his books is called A Religion of One's Own. And the problem that Westerners have had, particularly in North America, is that from the time of Nietzsche, there was recognition of all the holes that have been punched in the Christian myth for the last 500 years by the scientific method. And so all of us are susceptible to not accepting the Christian faith as the dominant in our psyche. And that's just a feature of being in Western civilization after 1900. And it's expressed in 280 million deaths in violent deaths, 280 million violent deaths in the 20th century. And, we're not seeing much of a phase back yet. I mean, there's still risk that sort of thing can continue. And so we need to find out what our dominant is and who we are. I mean, this was Dr. Jung's point, is that we have to be very much better acquainted with ourselves.
Well, the idea is that the religious images of Christianity no longer can carry the projection of a lot of moderns, that was what Edinger says in the preface to this book. He says that Jung was concerned to rescue for modern man. Now, to rescue Christianity for modern man is what he's saying. Jung was considered to rescue. He carried a Bible with him, by the way, everywhere he went. Sure. And he also, there was hardly anyone in the world that knew the Bible backwards and forwards like Carl Jung did. But anyway, he's concerned to rescue for modern man the spiritual treasures which the traditional religions can no longer carry. For many, God has abandoned his erstwhile dwelling that's his older dwelling in the churches, and is not likely to return. But here's the good news. We are living in what the Greeks call the kairos, the right moment for a metamorphosis of the gods and of the fundamental symbols. The numinosum is seeking a new incarnation. We can expect to find help in understanding that the new incarnation, the numinosum, is seeking by examining that great incarnation myth, the life of Christ.
Right. Okay. So one of the big issues is that all religions, and this includes Buddhism to my personal knowledge, and Christianity and Islam and Judaism, all rely on words. They all rely on the logos. And that means Buddha's breath here says, once the scriptures start speaking, then one is not limited to them. Everywhere you look, you will see my face. Like Buddha said, leave the boat behind once you have crossed the river. The key to have the scriptures is exegesis of the abstract, that is the opening of the intellect, the opening of the door. And so the point is that all religions, by definition, in order to be taught, have to be taught by the word. You have to explain things. And, in Buddhism, I always joke that you have, the 37 of this and the 8 of that and the 28 of this and so on. And they've sliced and diced everything down. And, it's like a philosopher trying to define meaning. Okay, but you can't define meaning. We have John Vervaeke who's saying awakening from the meaning crisis, but he's stuck in it because he's trying to define meaning as in a dictionary definition, and we're not talking about that meaning. You can't define it. The meaning is the meaning of your life, the meaning of our lives, and that is on the psychic side. That's
why Protestantism is so sterile. Protestantism it just concretizes everything so much, and it all has to be. We're going to give sermons. We're going to give a sermon, or we're going to explain a inexpressible myth to you in like 45 minutes of exposition, where most people fall asleep before it's over with. I mean, that's not what a church ritual service is supposed to be about. It's not about words. It's the wordless thing. So now you can't experience the wordless in the churches anymore. So where do you experience the wordless? You can experience it through the direct experience, which is initiated by the Annunciation. The Annunciation to a Jungian, someone who's seeking direct experience, is to realize that you're not the master in your own house. There is someone else in your psyche who is truly and really exists and sends you messages. Now, that's the Annunciation.
Right.
That's the Annunciation for the...
And I see it, just in my driving, for example, any number of times I've had experiences where I was almost in a collision and just at the last second missed it because I did a reflex action. I didn't know why I was doing the reflex action, but my psyche made me do it, and it just saved me. And that's happened to me many times. And so that, to me, is the hand of God coming down and protecting me. Now, if I talk about it in psychological terms rather than religious terms, then I say it's the 3.5 billion year old man who instinctually, by instinct, is providing me with exactly what I needed, exactly at the right time to be safe, to keep me safe, and keep me from having an accident.
He needs to give you, or this wisdom needs to give you images that are absolutely stunning. In other words, like I have one where I'm flying down the sidewalk. This is a dream, and while I'm flying down, I hear the voice of the self. This just the other night. My animals and I fly very high to console ourselves. Okay. Now this is a very mysterious statement, but it also it at least for myself, because I happen to me, is a very moving and profound statement, and I don't know what it means, but it is an annunciation. The annunciation is that you are sent a very powerful image, which is inexplicable, and yet this is exactly what you need to hear. And like Jung says, it's the task of tasks to find out, what does this mean to me? In other words, and then you take the image and you have the dialogue with it, and you then create the symbol, the transcendent function, which is the birth of the child.
Right. But in my experience, the one I was just describing about driving is it doesn't have to come in words. It can come in a reflex action. It's not something my ego takes any part in when it happens.
God protects you.
God's protecting
you. Right. But I mean, the idea, he also, in addition to protecting you, is trying to use you as a vehicle to create meaning in the outer world. I mean,
Right.
you need to be the vessel of an incarnation. For him keeping you from running off the road is to protect you as his vehicle, as his vessel for the incarnation, because he's not
Right.
done with you yet.
Right. And that is the image. It's not a picture, and it's not a word coming into my ears. It's actually a reflex. But nonetheless, that's the image in the Jungian sense. Now, there's a question here from Info Overdose, and I'll leave this open to the panel. How do we bridge the gap between theologians and Jungians?
But go ahead.
I was just going to say, one way, as I said, I prefer to say I'm a disciple of Jesus Christ as opposed to a Christian, because to me, there's a lot of serious reconciliation that needs to be done with the Christian world and what has gone down. I volunteer for an Indigenous gathering place society here in Calgary, and I volunteered at a tea ceremony just to be of service to them. And this tea ceremony, which involved smudging, involved listening to the prayer of the people of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Niitsitapi, the pipe ceremony, and then a round dance. That is back to what Craig was talking about, the sterility of some of the Protestant denominations. That tea ceremony was as numinous as anything I've ever experienced. Mm-hmm. And even though I don't understand the words of the elder saying the prayer, there's still something, seems to be coming through to me. The other thing to answer the question presently posed is perhaps disciple of Christ, or say you're a Jungian Christian, although I don't think Jung said he didn't want anybody to claim they're a Jungian.
I think Nancy Foff has done that.
Yeah, Nancy, would you speak to this? I mean, Father Don DeSan seems to have done it, and you have done it, so maybe you could describe it a bit.
Well, I met Brother Don DeSan in 1995, and as a result of dream work, I had a dream from which I woke up well after 9.5 years of severe illness. So that got my attention about dreams and about Jung, and I really began to get into it at that point, especially the dream work, realizing that the dream is an urgent message that I need to pay attention to, and to keep that ego self-axis in good health, to keep those messages coming and going through writing the dream, pondering the dream, painting the dream, giving it some kind of outward form.
Well, I think also you're touching on the great task, which is a reinterpretation of all the religions in the context of modern categories of understanding. And one of the big problems we have in bridging the gap between theologians and Jungians is theologians are still at one another's throats. And so they want to talk about what's wrong with this other branch of the faith, whatever it is, this other sect of Protestantism or this other part of Catholicism. And they're always saying, well, this is better than that. And it seems to me that the first step is that we have to have theologians who are prepared to look back and see what they have in common.
What Jung said about theologians and memories, dreams and reflections, that he is sure that none of the theologians that he ever knew had ever seen with their own eyes the light that shineth in the darkness. For he says, if they had, they would not have been able to teach a theological religion, if they had with their own eyes seen the light that shineth in the darkness. And he says the arch sin of faith is that it forestalls the direct experience. So, and he also said that the two people that seemed to have their most problem with him were theologians and other psychologists.
Yeah, right.
And he says it's both surprising and not surprising. You know, they
Right.
both thought he was nuts.
Well,
One of the things that I learned as a church consultant was that in a church, this is simplifying, but there are those who are way out in front, the first adopters. And then there are those that are way in the tradition and just really locked in there. But there are people in the middle. And it's the people in the middle that can talk to the very traditionalists and help to bridge that. But there are going to be some things that are just not acceptable to certain stages of faith of Jung's teachings.
At certain stages, certainly.
At certain stages,
Yeah.
they cannot buy into certain of Jung's teachings.
I would separate traditionalists from fundamentalists. You know, Jung is a traditionalist in every sense of the word. I mean, he takes seriously all the images in the Christian myth and in the Old Testament. He takes them very seriously as authentic expressions of the psyche. You know,
Precisely.
yet he is not a fundamentalist.
Well, and he reinterpreted those images. And what's interesting about Eggener's book is that all the images that he presented were from the 14th and 15th centuries in his book. Mm-hmm. And they were from the illuminated manuscripts, which I just love because I'm working on doing some illumination stuff. But those images still, if you look at them in their original context, you know, to me, they have that effect, you know, a deep effect.
Sure.
If you look at it after reading what Edginger is saying, so.
Right.
That was before the epistemological criticism kicked in.
Right.
Right.
That's before we had critics. For those of you who don't know this term, epistemological criticism, it means people slicing and dicing other people's ideas and not appreciating them. So
well, if they don't have that deep affect and experience, they can talk and slice and dice all day, and they're not getting anywhere.
That's right, precisely.
I don't see anything coming out of that in terms of talking about what Jung's talking about the deep sense, the feeling, the experience itself, and bringing that stuff forward. So.
Right. So Art says, I feel that lesson to Carl Jung has helped, or listening to Carl Jung has helped me have a deeper understanding of my faith. God comes to us in ways that we can understand. And I think that's quite right. And Buddha's Breath says there is a Sufi thought, Wahdatul Wujud, unity of being, that the only reality is that of God. To experience it, one has to remove doubts, because doubt is the veil between you and God, whatever and wherever that doubt might be. The eternal voice must follow the image. And okay, fair enough. And so that, what I'm saying is you can't doubt at least the God image, because it speaks to all of us, and it's this part of our psyche that has kept all of our ancestors alive and reproducing for the last 3.5 billion years successfully. Every one of our ancestors reproduced successfully. So there was in the unconscious of the very first creatures who are our ancestors enough unconscious insight to keep them alive. That's a key thing, I think. And then you don't have to, there's just no way to doubt that fact.
But, you know, in my opinion, you know, you asked one time whether animals have visions. The wisdom that's informing our dreams and is forming our images, our visions, and informing our active imaginations, and deciding what hexagram of the I Ching will show up at the next time you toss it, is the same one that shaped our bodies. And it's the same wisdom that has shaped all bodies, you know, and it is the wisdom that tells the animals to run for higher ground before the tsunami hits. It's the wisdom that tells the birds to fatten up before the snowstorm hits. They get these visions from the same source that informs our dreams.
Precisely.
You know, and I just wanted to finish one thing about the Enunciation is, you know, Edinger quotes paragraph 492 from Mysterium, but he left out this part, which is just right after what he quoted, is, and this kind of summarizes the Enunciation, what the Enunciation means. The announcement, you're sitting there and Gabriel suddenly appears before you. You're just a woman, you know, but I'm a woman. I'm Mary. And the angel Gabriel appears before me. I have never seen an angel before. He appears before me and gives you this message that you are to be the vessel of the incarnation. But what Jung says that Edinger left out in that paragraph is this reality, this Enunciation, comes upon us just as the stigmata comes to the saints without being consciously sought. The stigmata is where a saint would suddenly have all the nail holes show up in his hands and that Christ had. You know, I mean, all the wounds that Christ had would show up on the saint's body. They appear spontaneously. It happens, it just, all of these things, that's what the Enunciation is. It is a spontaneous announcement that cannot be ignored. So now you have been given this incredible vision. If you ignore it,
No,
I don't even see how you can go on.
No,
how you can go on with your life if the Gabriel appears.
Right. It cannot be ignored. There's no doubt about that.
So it's an event that occurs in your life that happens spontaneously, like the stigmata to the saints, that has totally now, there's pre the Enunciation and after the Enunciation. So you've had the Enunciation, you're Mary. Now what happens? Now this is talking to us, not to Mary, not to the Christian image.
Because all of us have these religious experiences and we just have to recognize them. Okay, we've gotten through one chapter of 7, so I think I need to move on here. So let me share again my screen and we'll go back to this point that Craig had jumped ahead with, which is the nativity. The individual ego is the stable in which the Christ child is born. And that's from Psychology and Religion, paragraph 267. So, Craig, do you want to comment on that again?
Well, it's just that the idea here of the Christian myth that it applies to the 13 steps that Edinger announces at the beginning there's a dual aspect to it. One is the changes in the self along each one of the 13 paths, but additionally, at the same time, simultaneously, and this is happening in you, that first at the Enunciation, the self is latent. It's like the unawoken Kundalini serpent. It has awoken. Now, through each one of the 13 steps, the self is going to transform. but so are you. So you're the ego. The ego is the manger or the stable in which the Christ child is born. And the Christ child, or any child,
and so that's consciousness, and
yes,
Christ represents the divine child.
Well, also represents the created product of the dialogue between the Holy Spirit and yourself, or the fact that that Gabriel tells Mary that the Holy Spirit is going to come in to her and she's going to produce a child. The self and your ego consciousness are going to have the same created product, but the created product in your life, and is going to be a divine child, but its nature initially is going to be a transforming symbol of meaning through the dialogue between this self and your ego. The fact that the enunciation should really be in everyone's life is, I am not the master in my own house. I am the servant and the vessel of the incarnation. That's what the enunciation is saying. So what is your response to it? You realize that you have to be the handmaid, as Mary says, the handmaid and the servant of the Lord. So that what you're looking for from the self, and Edinger says this is what all prayer asks for, is a image with which you can have a dialogue. Now, this image which you can have a dialogue, when you do have the dialogue, if it's one that is productive, it is one that where the transcendent function, or the third is the child. The transcendent function is the child. It's the divine child. You are the vessel of the incarnation. You are the stable where this divine child is born. So right. I mean, and then
so in terms of in terms of everyday life, this comes up in debate, for example, where there's thesis, antithesis, and then the synthesis of the two is the divine child. That's the solution.
Yes.
And that's what the divine child is representing.
And Meister Eckhart says you need to give birth to this divine child every day.
Yeah. Now,
I mean, it's
Miles. There's a question here from Carl Andrews, who says that he's reading a book about Native American church, and he wants to know what kind of tea is being used in that tea ceremony you were referring to.
I could research that maybe in a future.
Is it sage?
Event. Well,
sage?
they burn they're smudging with grass, and there's also sage, and whether the tea is made from local, like a local plant or juniper berry, I'm not entirely sure, or whether they just use any tea they have. The tea ceremony, what this involved is there's different types of ceremonies for different purposes. So this particular tea ceremony was where people were seeking the elders' blessing, the elders' direction, and the tea. I'm not even going to try to speak for them, but
okay. Well, let's
some of it's even secret. Sorry.
Okay, so let's move on then. Carl Andrews makes the comment. He's commenting about bringing theologians and Jungians together. He says, "Good luck with the theologians. Theologians, they don't know nothing about my soul. They don't know." And I think that in many respects, theologians now teach Christianity in a cookie cutter kind of way in many instances. And they don't really know what it is that they're doing. I mean, these things were better known in the Middle Ages, actually, and then they were forgotten. Okay, and so, for example, I'll just share with the people who are not in the advanced group. We had this image, which Jordan Peterson initially brought to my attention, and then one of our advanced group members found this good quality image of it. And so this is the open virgin, and what this is the Virgin Mary, but when you open her up, she's actually Mother Nature. And so Mother Nature has God within her, and God is holding up his son Christ in the image. And this image was suppressed in the Middle Ages for lots of reasons that we can imagine as a result of patriarchal religion. But I'll just show you the outside of this box. Let's see, here it is, I think, just so you can see that the unopened box is the Virgin Mary wearing a headpiece like a nun might wear, I suppose. And she's got the Christ child in her arms. But then when you open the box, you realize that the reference is actually to Mother Nature itself, and the part of nature that we're denying.
Yeah, and if I could add, talking about Mother Nature, this is where I find the First Nations or Indigenous Native American spirituality really something we need to, don't be afraid to explore in your local area. Because, for example, the Niitsitapi, who we know as the Blackfoot Confederacy, the word for God in their language means the giver of life. Is that not a great definition of God for us, in Mother Nature? And what I would suggest is that some of this person just commented about theologians not knowing, my soul or your soul. To a certain degree, that from one denomination to another, they are more, I don't know if it's a word, but creed centric. So there's an creed of Athanasia, which basically says, yeah, you're going to hell if you're not baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit type thing. That's what I would say is very creed centric. And that's why this Vatican II Council document about their opening the door to other religions also being saved, they're not going to declare that at least that council said they're not going to declare that everybody's going to hell if they weren't exposed to Christianity. I find that very amazing, because when I wanted to marry my wife Gina, I was going to an Orthodox church, and she wanted to be married in the Roman Catholic Church. I hadn't been baptized in either one, and she was insistent. And the Orthodox priest told me, well, if you go and get married over there, you're never going to be Eastern Orthodox. We're not going to allow you in. I was like, well, up yours, the whole thing. So, but anyway, I just find being very open.
Yeah, and that's the tragedy of the last 2,000 years, that we've been fighting over religion all this time. But let us go back to this point now on the nativity. And my interpretation of this is that what is being said is that the stable is actually the location of the instincts. And we were talking in the advanced group the other day about how religions came up as a antidote to raw instinct. And so when you're born and when you're young, you think you're a little god. And if anybody has children, they know their kids go around thinking they're little gods, and then ultimately are kings and queens. And then after they get straightened out a few times, they start to get toilet trained and other things. And so the ego gets let's say, adjusted. I don't know if that's a good way to say it. Nancy, do you have a comment on this point?
Well, from a personal perspective, I have often prayed, Lord Jesus, be born in this place meaning some aspect of myself, some shadow material that has arisen, be born in this place and work out your healing, recreative love there. And I picture the creation of the universe and all that power, and inviting that kind of power and love and creativity into that dark place in me, and bringing health and wholeness. And I have found that that prayer is answered all the time. It may take a little while, but I can look back a year after praying something like that, and I have changed. I've been changed. So, and I think too, at least at one point in my Christianity, to think of Jesus, this glorious being, coming into my life, which is so mixed in terms of good and evil, was very difficult. But to think of Jesus, the baby, being born in a stable with animals and smells and the natural world, then the intimacy that implies could help me feel very close and loved by God.
Right. Okay, so the next stage is called the flight into Egypt. And so let me share the beginning of that chapter. And so in the flight into Egypt, the Jungian quote is, when a summit of life is reached, when the bud unfolds and from the lesser the greater emerges, then, as Nietzsche says, one becomes two, and the greater figure, which one always was, but which remained invisible, appears to the lesser personality with the force of a revelation, a moment of deadliest peril. And so basically what he's saying is that in the first half of life, which is one of the topics that Dr. Jung was commenting on often, he wanted people in the second half of life, but in the first half of life, the self, the God image, is literally forcing you to learn how to be a human being, learn how to reproduce and get that done. So then you hit 35 or 40, you've got kids, and for better or for worse, you've got your kids, and you've fulfilled your obligation to reproduce to the self, to the eternal self. And then you have to figure out what your life is really going to be about after you've completed that fundamental instinctual activity of reproduction.
That's the idea of the virgin birth. You know, the idea is that the birth of this second you, and really the second you is now where the center of awareness is not just an ego consciousness, and there is now a hybrid sense of awareness where there's actually three parts. One is the self, one is the ego consciousness, and the third is that is being created is this new center of awareness that is closer to the middle plane between the two worlds. Now, this is that greater part of us. And, it's kind of represented, of course, with the virgin birth. The virgin birth is not a psychological birth. It's also represented in Christ Pantocrator, which is the, where he's quoting Nietzsche here. What he's kind of quoting is this. I don't know if it's going to come out. No.
Okay. So this is the image that shows Christ with one eye looking inward and one eye looking outward, right? In this image, the one on the left especially. Why did that get so small all of a sudden? Greg? Oh, we lost Craig, and we lost his image too. Okay.
I just wonder if the flight into Egypt, it says it's the time of greatest peril. So many people at that age of, in their 20s and 30s, will fall prey to nihilism, and particularly now with the opioids, it's very, very easy to try to, deal with your meaning crisis by alcohol or drugs. Is that somewhat related to this stage we're talking about?
Actually, no. That's in the earlier stage of failure to launch, okay. where someone hasn't found the meaning, and John Vervaeke hasn't helped them find the meaning, even though he's given them 50 hours of video on the meaning, on awakening from the meaning crisis. But in order to have meaning in your life, you have to first get one. And so, when you have a little baby, for example, you get meaning, okay, real quick. And especially mothers, but fathers too. And my first baby was born weighing 2 pounds and 4 ounces. And I can tell you that was a very meaningful moment for my wife and me at the time. And, and it gave me huge meaning, but fortunately she survived and is now 45 years old and has 3 children of her own. And she's quite the woman. And she's actually has a master's degree in social work. And so anyway,
I didn't know how to kill that image, so I left the meeting and came back.
Oh, okay. I
got trapped. I'm sorry.
That's right.
Well, I think the failure to launch is what you said, Skip. When you go from childhood and into young adulthood, you have to get a strong ego, and otherwise you will not be able to survive that. So we've got 2 problems here. One is you're already up to flight to Egypt, but we've kind of neglected the part that Jordan Peterson's interested in, is getting these young people on the right track to launch.
Right.
So that they will have an ego and a life and have kids and a family, a successful career, and finding out what their passion is that they're good at.
Right.
From their strength. And
go ahead.
And then they can get to the flight to Egypt. So, I mean, we've really jumped ahead here.
Right. And so the point is, the nihilism question is a question that really comes up at the end of childhood, where you don't become a mature individual. And I think that's the reason Jordan Peterson has become so popular, is because he's offered a father figure to a lot of young men who are raised up in single family homes and didn't get the kick in the pants that a father would give a son or a daughter. You know, I never needed a kick in the pants because I always knew I was going to be in the military, and my father it was the family business, so I never needed that kick in the pants. But I think that a lot of young men, and especially a lot of young men today, need a kick in the pants to say, well, okay, you're 18 or you're 21 right now, and I've put you through college, or I'm done raising you. Now you have a nice life. I mean, that's what a mama bear says. Jerome has a black bear outside his house, and what the black bear does is the mother takes care of the babies for 2 years, and after the 2 years are over, she turns around to them and growls and basically says, "Have a nice life," and then you have to get on with it. And I think that what Jordan Peterson is doing is providing a lot of the structural ideas that a father might give a young man, especially.
Yeah, it's like the bear teaches the two cubs for a couple of years before she kicks them out. You know,
Right.
it
So
just takes us a little longer, but the young people are not getting taught the skills and how to survive in the outside world here.
I would say, though, the one that's fleeing into Egypt are not the cubs; it's the mother. You know, the idea of the Exodus and the flight into Egypt is you have had this miraculous birth of the divine child. Now, how do you protect it from the ordinary reality of all those around you? You know, in India, what happens is the father gets to be about 45, and suddenly one day he leaves and goes into the forest, and it's called the forest years. You know, he's now fleeing into Egypt because he needs to protect this divine second birth through the virgin that has been born from being
within him. It's his life you're talking about.
Yes, he's the one fleeing into Egypt. So this is the fleeing into Egypt is the idea that you need to leave society to be for the gestation period and of bringing this child from infancy to adulthood within your psyche. You know,
Right.
so it is you know, a lot of people Jung had this through his Red Book.
Right.
His Red Book years. Martin Buber had this exact same experience when he discovered Hasidism. He left the seminary. He went into the wilderness, and he spent over 5 years doing nothing but in personal meditation. The idea, I think, of the Exodus, the 40 years in Sinai Desert, of Israel, you know, is what gives birth to Israel. You know, in other words, Israel cannot come into being. The Promised Land cannot come into being until the Exodus, these forest years, this Exodus, this period in the wilderness has played out.
Okay, yeah, but let's not confuse the New Testament and the Old Testament, if you don't mind.
Well, they're the same thing,
right? Okay.
The flight
okay,
of
but
Herod.
Craig. I'm trying to get through the Christian cycle. Okay. Here.
Well, yeah, but Edinger compared them, not me. Edinger in the book
Edinger
compares,
wrote a different book, which we're going to talk about in
but I mean,
course.
in this chapter, he says that the flight from Herod by Joseph and Mary is similar to the flight of the Israelites from Exodus, in the Exodus. That's why he calls it the Exodus. The Exodus into Egypt is actually what we're discussing is Joseph and Mary fleeing from the dominant conscious attitude, which is King Herod.
Right.
And then he gives that wonderful speech of a poem. Edinger loved poetry, and he had that wonderful poem there of the agony of the king. He was trying to give Herod a pass.
Right. Yeah, that was a good thing. I agree. And that was in this chapter.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
Okay.
that's what, the chapter is called the Exodus. So he's comparing the flight of Joseph and Mary to the
the chapter
flight out
is
of
called
Egypt.
The Flight into Egypt. So I don't want to get too confused here, but the point.
Yeah, that would be more what Joseph did. I think he meant the other way around.
The point is that all of these biblical stories are archetypal stories that apply to all of us, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I'm just trying to, for the sake of people who are newbies here, who are not part of the advanced group, Craig, I'm just trying to give them a context that is contiguous here. So I don't want to get too far afield.
Well, why did they name the chapter the Exodus?
No, they named it the Escape into Egypt.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
All right, well, anyway.
Flight into
Egypt. And the Exodus was the other way around. The Exodus
but in either case,
out of the Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
But in either case, they were had to leave, as you said, because of Herod. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
They didn't go along with the traditional, what was going on in the society at the time, and so they decided to leave.
Precisely.
Well, they were going to kill Jesus. They killed all their children under 2 years old.
Right.
That's not just disagreeing with the.
Yeah.
Well, it is disagreeing in a sense.
Yeah.
In other words, you're fleeing from your, who's in control, and
if you're going to allow the ones in control to kill your kids, then you deserve what you get.
You weren't part of that society, so you had to leave. And but it's also in terms of a person that's involved in this, is they realize that they can't get. They realize something needs to change.
Right. Okay. Well, let's move on to the next level. But basically, the flight into Egypt is the gestation period between youth and midlife. I think in the context of what?
Of the divine child.
Of the divine child.
Yeah, not of us, but of the. It's again a stage in the development of both the self and the ego in individuating.
Yes. Okay. So the next step is the baptism, and this is very rudimentary overview stuff we're talking about here, obviously, but we're just trying to get through it. We have 4 more chapters to talk about. We might not get to them all tonight, but chapter 4 was baptism. And so Jung says, what is it in the end that induces a man to go his own way and to rise out of the unconscious identity with the mass? It is what is commonly called vocation, which acts like a law of God from which there is no escape. Anyone with a vocation hears the voice of the inner man. He is called. And as most of you probably know, when a pastor is invited to be the pastor of a church, he receives a call from the elders of a church saying that, this is, you're invited to have your vocation here. But it's what Edinger is talking about here is the call to what it is you're going to be in your life. And, there's many aspects of it. I mean, I've had many calls, because first I was called to the Marines, and that doesn't mean my selective service people called me, but it means I was destined, felt that I should serve in the military. And my father never said that to me. I just grokked it, let's say. and so here in this chapter, Jung is talking, or Edinger is talking about this call of Christ, and the baptism with John the Baptist is Christ being called into the spiritual realm. And actually, there's some quite beautiful passages here, but in this chapter, let's see if I can think of them, find them here. But because there's quite a number of scenes here. For example, Christ is called, and this Holy Spirit comes down to him in this baptism, and he doesn't. Jesus, the man, says to John the Baptist that, he wants to have this change in his spirit. And so when John the Baptist baptizes him, then the Holy Spirit comes down to him, and then he goes off into his ministry, I believe. And the first thing that happens, and this is the issue that was raised earlier on the chat, is that he goes into the desert, which I think a lot of holy people do. Anyway, comments?
Well, the idea of the baptism is really is a descent into the depths, and where you're supposed to almost die, and you get the wisdom of the depths, and then you come up back out of the depths through the baptism, and then there's the descent of the Holy Spirit.
The problem with how it's done in Western Protestantism, at least, and maybe in Catholicism, is, how does a baby take on that meaning? I mean, maybe Nancy can tell us, but I never understood that, because you have to at least be old enough to understand what the heck is being talked about here. And what I found, because I did have a numinous experience with the baptism of one of my grandsons, is that in the way it's handled in the Christian church, is that it's really the community accepting the child to bring the child up within the church and to teach the child. But the child doesn't know what the heck's going on. It just gets angry because it got a wet face, and so it cries typically.
Well, Edinger called adult baptism, or what the baptism that supposedly have taken place here, is a salutio, and in alchemy, and that's where all fixities, all certainties are dissolved. So anything that was fixed before has been is gone. So when you come back out, everything is fluid, salutio. So now you've emerged out of the depths, obtaining the wisdom there, but now you and your psyche are fluid. There are no more certainties or fixities. So you are open now for the imaginal life, for the creation of the symbols of the incarnation of the divine, to create a a new meaning that has never before been seen on land or sea. This is your individuation. This is your individual quest. And you can't do it with any fixed forms or theological principles that existed before. So once you have emerged out of the depths and experienced the solutio, you are now open and fluid to the next steps.
Right. And Edinger's talking about this, though, in the context of vocation, and bringing it to your attention in the context of vocation.
Your calling.
Your calling to what your life is.
Your job. Yeah.
Yeah.
Your second half.
But in terms of the spiritual aspect, okay, that was only Christ, okay, or people who are going to be theologians or religious teachers. But the point is that all of us have to accept vocation and move on with it and press forward with that vocation, which is the point that he's making here, I think.
Jung described this as, by what myth am I living? That was his vocation, his calling. Jung wanted to know, this was Jung's vocation, Jung's calling, was, he said, the task of tasks was to find out by what myth that he, C.G. Jung, was living, because he didn't know. So his vocation and his calling was to find out what that was.
Well, I think, Craig, what you said at the first part of your statement, not this last one, was well put. And what I think Skip was saying is that I know a lot of theologians who get a call to their vocation. So they have an experience and they're called by the Spirit. It comes down and tells them that that is their vocation. So
it's their place.
Right. And then their whole life is then centered around that because they felt like they've had that contact.
Right. And then and we need Nancy to intervene here, but then so in the context of the church and the religious life, yes, it's a calling to the religious life, but in terms of individuation from a psychological point of view, Edinger's talking about it in terms of a commitment to what you're going to do in your life beyond Sunday church. But Nancy, let's give you a chance to say something here.
Well, when I think of vocation, it's more a sense of an internal response to a call that's bigger than me. So the first one that I can recall was my conversion to Christ, when I had an experience of God's love that was so dramatic and physical, mental, and spiritual, emotional, that I was so sure there was a God who loved me that I wanted to put time in that direction. And putting time in that direction meant choosing certain activities to do, one of which I did was to start helping ex-prisoners find a stable life. So that I'm kind of thinking vocation in that kind of trajectory.
Well, that's definitely a call, surely, but not everyone is going to do something like that.
And well, remember too that you, in the Annunciation, you have agreed to be the handmaid and the servant of the Lord. So it's not so much a vocation or calling of what you're going to do in your life. It's what are you going to do, or how are you going to proceed as the handmaid and the servant of the Lord? You know, in other words, you, again, the whole aspect of this whole, the Christian myth is this, which he said in the first sentence, is it's the myth of incarnation. So that when they're talking about vocation or talking about calling, they're talking about the calling that you receive now having agreed to be the vessel of the incarnation, not what does my ego want to do? What does my ego want to do here? What does my ego? I want to go on a vacation. I want to get a brand new Jaguar or something like that.
Okay, well, I want to keep bringing it back to the depth psychology issue, though.
It is depth psychology.
No, but Craig, we don't want to give the impression, or at least I don't, and I'm not sure that maybe others do, but I don't want to give the impression that Jungian psychology means that you're going to become Jesus Christ.
No, okay. It's not Jesus Christ. You're going to
Spirit is going to come upon you and you're going to become a religious person. The point
it's nothing like that. You're going to be a natural being of nature. In other words, before you were an ego who was separated from your real nature. So the idea of wholeness is now you are not separated from your real nature, and your real nature is the wisdom that shaped your body. It needed your ego to separate from itself so that you could become a powerful vehicle of its incarnation in the world. So
which
in the second,
obviously Nancy has done that with her work with prisoners, and recently
all of us
released
need to do that.
Well, all of us don't need to go to the prison and rehabilitate prisoners. That's not the meaning.
No, I don't even think that that's really what the idea is, that you take that you need to move your center of awareness away from your ego and closer to the middle plane. That's your calling. That's the vessel of the incarnation.
But in terms of what the point that Edinger is making here is that Edinger is making a point about your development, your psychological development toward how you're going to live your life. And it doesn't mean that you're going to leave church on Sunday morning and go out and proselytize or any other such thing. It means that you're going to live a virtuous moral life, maybe, but it also means that you're going to, as Jordan Peterson says, take up a load and make a contribution to your society and your civilization.
I don't think Skip, that's part of it.
Yeah, Skip, I think that if you go to number 5, which is the triumphal entry into Jerusalem.
Right. Okay, let me go to that.
Yeah, we call it, we must do just what Christ did. We must make our experiment.
Correct.
We must make mistakes. We must live out our own vision of life. So it's your vision of life. And there will be error. If you avoid error, you do not live.
Correct.
So you can either try to live it and try not to, make mistakes and stuff. You're going to make mistakes. That's all there is to it. Right. That's the way you learn. But I think to put this together, I think that entry is you discover what it is that you want to do. And I would equate some of it to find your passion in terms of what you really truly want to do. And put that out.
Following your bliss is really,
right.
But it's it isn't. This is not a personalistic psychology. I mean, it's a psychology of really of surrender as a very powerful ego. You're not surrendering your ego, but you are letting it be a vehicle to incarnate the images of the self in the outer world in the second half of life. This is after you've raised your children and developed a strong ego.
Yeah, as they apply to each individual.
And nobody knows what that is. I mean,
that's right.
What Joseph Campbell says. He says, and where it is all leading, he says, I will not even say God knows, because God does not know where it's leading. God is on the journey with you.
Right.
And he isn't knowing where it's going.
Right. So the interesting issue here in the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which I never thought about, honestly. And I'll ask Nancy if she's thought about this, but what the way Edinger presents this material in this chapter is that it appears that he's seeing these events as Christ experiencing and acting out his shadow, because the way he says it, he talks about Christ cursing the fig tree, and then Christ coming in and throwing all the money changers out of the temple, and then also Christ taking the donkey, which is a fulfillment of prophecy. So Christ was actually play acting in a way. This is the way Edinger seems to describe it. He says that Christ was play acting things that had been prophesied. And so he had planned to have this donkey, and he sent one of his disciples in to get this donkey that apparently had been pre-planned so that it would come out and he could ride it into Jerusalem. But it wasn't his donkey, and it was him sort of being a poseur in a way, because he was acting out something that had been prefigured and was a prophecy. But the idea of the way he presents it, and this is a questionable, and I want to hear Nancy's comment on this. I never realized that this stuff was shadow material, but Edinger says Christ had to experience all the things that a man experiences. Basically, that's what he's saying by this triumphal entry here.
Well, before I read Edinger, I always thought of these things as his humanity was showing. Right. And at one time I studied death and dying and was on the crisis call center line here in Reno. And we had to study the different stages of dying, like there's anger and denial first, and then anger, and then bargaining, and so forth, and depression, and then kind of an acceptance of things. So I always saw it as his humanity. He knew he was facing his death. So his anger is being expressed. In the garden, his bargaining is being expressed, and so forth. Whether that's shadow or not, it seems to me that might be debatable, but certainly his humanity.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's the way I saw it until I read Edinger. So maybe Edinger is projecting some shadow onto this because he wants to get a little shadow into the story. But anyway, let's see.
Skip, you might want to unshare your screen.
Okay, yes, I will do that. All right. So PC Development says, vocation is a receiving of the inner voice and a fidelity to one's own law, a personal, individual law, whether good, evil, or balanced. And I think that fundamentally does reflect what Dr. Jung had in mind. Do you disagree with that, Craig?
No, I mean, Jung often used to put it in terms of my snake won't let me do this, and my snake won't let me do that. In other words, it wasn't a rational judgment that he talks about. He's talking about the truth that gripped him, was his. I like the way that what was his name put it, was the fundamental law, or the fundamental law within us is really the calling is becoming your rhizome. You know, I mean, this is becoming the root that you are, the root that is underground waiting to come up to earth. The ego is off on its own way. So really the calling is the root reminding you, hey, I'm down here. I'm very, very deep, you know, and I am very, very ancient, and I'm very, very old, and I am you. And I want to blossom and flower above the surface.
Right.
You know, so you need to help that need happen. That's your vocation. That's your calling.
And I think, and Dr. Jung puts it pretty succinctly in paragraph 746 of Answer to Job. He says, I won't read all of it, but he says, the conscious realization of what is hidden and kept secret certainly confronts us with an insoluble conflict. At least this is how it appears to the conscious mind. The ego is what he's talking about. But the symbols that rise up out of the unconscious in dreams show it rather as a confrontation of opposites, and the images of the goal represent their successful reconciliation. Something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. It is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. If this does not happen, the process of individuation will nevertheless continue. The only difference is that we become its victims and are dragged along by fate towards the inescapable goal, which we might have reached walking upright if only we had taken the trouble and been patient enough to understand in time the meaning of the noumena that cross our path. And that sort of sums it up. And that's basis of one of my religious experiences, because I was actually reading that paragraph when I had a religious experience, which I'll be talking about next week. So Opal said I have to go now. Okay, all right, so let's see if we can get through two more. So then the next one is the Last Supper. And again, this one's a little bit difficult to understand, but it says, if the projected conflict is to be healed, in other words, the conflict between the conscious and the unconscious, it must return into the psyche of the individual where it had its unconscious beginnings. He must celebrate a last supper with himself, his ego, and eat his own flesh and drink his own blood, which means that he must recognize and accept the other in himself. Is this perhaps the meaning of Christ's teaching that each must bear his own cross? For if you have to endure yourself, how will you be able to rend others also? And so that's Jung from Mysterium, volume 14, paragraph 512.
That has a lot of implications, Skip, in terms of, I was thinking about what you've done on Donald Cowshed and trauma. The trauma victims, if you read this statement, they need to go back and re-experience the trauma, that's not what they're doing these days. They're just drugging them and not facing that particular trauma.
Right. And very often, I mean, many of my religious experiences have emanated from a trauma. Okay, so right. Something numinous occurred to me that provided me with a solution to something that had been or was traumatic to me. Right.
Yeah. Great.
And so this is God's hand, pulling me out of my funk, basically. and that's what the religious experience partially is. I mean, there's many examples, which I'm going to talk about next Sunday, but that's going to be separate from the Monday night event. This is just a unique one-off event that I'm doing next Sunday in the sanctuary of a church, believe it or not. I've had only a few, 4 or 5 of my numinous experiences have actually occurred in a sanctuary, and very few. I think I can only think of 3 that actually occurred during services, but they do happen to me almost daily, so I notice them.
I really think this is the beginning of walking down into the underworld. You know, it's the beginning of the night sea journey. And so they're doing this ritual before all of these things that have happened up to this point. There is going to be a rebirth, another type of a rebirth, you know,
Right,
and so this is the beginning, and the act of it's sort of of course this is a mass, is what it is. He's celebrating the mass. So what is the mass? The Last Supper is the mass. What is the ritual of the mass? You know, is that there's a sacrifice. He's making an initial sacrifice before then he descends into the depths through this journey of the Via Dolorosa, or whatever it is that happens after that. So this is kind of the mass before the resolution that leads to the death and rebirth.
In terms of our own lives, in terms of individuation, it seems to me that the sacrifice is often that something like, okay, when you're a kid, you have all kinds of ideas about what you could be in life. But ultimately, when you're 20, 21 years old, you have to fish and cut bait, and you have to sacrifice all those other things that you thought you could be, like a heroic football player or whatever it is. And even if you're a professional football player, when you're 40, you're done. And so then you have to go into this new life, regardless of how good you were on the football field. And you got another 60 years of life to go. And so you have to sacrifice all the things, the cheering and the wonderful stuff that was in the football stadium, and you have to be reborn into what are you going to do now for the next 60 years. And so in terms of a life, I think that's what we're talking about.
What would let's say that you were going to have the ritual of the Mass, and the ritual of the Mass was what was going to precede the most profound steps of your own wholeness, your own transfer. What would that Mass be like? You know, I mean, you study what the ritual of the Mass is in the Catholic Church. You learn what it is, and then you say, well, how am I going to have a Mass to begin my own, just as a ritual of the Mass before I descend deeply into the depths to become reborn again?
Maybe for a professional football player, your Mass would be a big party when you retire from the football field, and recognizing that you're going to leave that kind of a life behind unless you're staying on as a coach or something like that.
But, be like a retirement party.
Yeah,
something like that.
Could be. Yeah. That could be the kind of thing it is. Or
I think that's a very close analogy. It sounds a little mundane, but I think it's actually really close.
Well, it's what our lives are like. I mean, it's not, the Eucharist is fine as a symbol, but this is a reflection of what our lives are like, because when we reach a certain stage, we have to sacrifice our ideas of what we might become and realize what's possible and what we're called to do. And so here I am leading this group now, and it really has nothing to do with the things that I did earlier in life. Nothing. I mean, my experiences inform what I do now, but they didn't prepare me for it at all.
Well, as a non-Catholic person, I'm a little ignorant what the
I'm not a Catholic either.
function and the ritual of the Mass is. But I think,
but we're talking about the Eucharist too, so it's the Protestant Church too.
Yeah, well, I'm saying that this is what is the function of the Mass that applies to our own journey to move our center of awareness into this third point. And I don't know. I mean, I need somebody who knows more about the Mass to explain it to us, or read what Jung's saying is.
It's not only the Mass; it's also the Lord's Supper in Protestantism, and
it's a ritual.
We're trying to transcend between the conscious mind and the self. So we're trying to transcend, and we do that by trying to take on to ourselves the teachings of Christ by eating it, basically. Atheists and agnostics often are derisive of the Mass being like cannibalism, but actually what Edinger says here and what Jung says is that's exactly what it is. It's touching on rituals that have gone back in human experience far before the Old Testament. And
it's the Ouroboros. I mean, if you look at the Ouroboros, that's essentially is what the Mass is about.
Right.
But I mean, at a very primitive level or primary level.
Yeah, it's very primitive. But it's communicating with a primitive, primordial part of ourselves. That's what it's doing. Nancy, do you have a thought about this? I really would like to hear.
Not so much. Just personal experience, I guess. There was a time when I took the religious vows temporarily for a year, and it was an offering of myself to love and to be love to others. And when I would take the Eucharist in the Mass, there was a sense of being one with Christ, who gave his life out of love for me. So there was a sense of intimacy, a sense of what would you say? Contact, certainly. And I use the phrase these days, Christ in me, living as me, a sense of communication. He's communicated himself to me and in me and through me.
Yeah. To me, it always was basically a commitment, by taking the bread and the wine, I thought I was committing myself to the values of the church, basically, and taking that commitment into myself. But that's the way I saw it. I didn't see it as, living as Christ in me, but I didn't have that kind of teaching growing up. So maybe I would have if I'd had a different type of teaching.
Well, the people I know that take that, it's a reminder by doing that particular ritual or ceremony that you have to be vigilant about this stuff and not, it keeps you centered in terms of focused on that particular aspect. And so that's why you see a lot of times people sometimes pray 5 times a day or something like that. Or
and
they establish something, because if you're not vigilant, you can slip back.
Right, and Edinger does comment, and maybe he was quoting someone, but he says that if you're not sincere and you take the bread and the wine, then it's going to turn against you. Okay, karma is going to come and get you. So, okay, let's take one more. Last chapter, which is Gethsemane. And it's sort of an important idea because Christ had doubts in Gethsemane. And so he went into the garden with his disciples after the Last Supper. And he knew at that point that he was going to be crucified. And he prayed, he wanted his disciples to help him with that decision. And they didn't, they fell asleep. And so he had to make the decision by himself. And he prayed 3 times. And so what Jung says here, the quote that it begins this chapter is, the problem of crucifixion is the beginning of individuation. There is the secret meaning of the Christian symbolism, a path of blood and suffering. And so it's recognizing, accepting that you have a mature responsibility in life, and there is going to be pain, and it's you have to accept the opposites. You have to accept both sides, which is what the cross symbolizes, at least to Jung, which is that the cross symbolizes being pulled apart by the opposites, and you have to realize that you have to live that life in a mature way. And there was a footnote here, which I think is significant, so I put it in red. He said, in an unpublished letter, he said, "We discern a crimson line on this earth, a red blood-spattered line, which ascends struggling from matter to plants, from plants to animals, from animals to man." And it so happens that, I don't know if I still have it on my screen. I might, I have to check. I wrote an essay about this because what Jung realized in the Red Book, and there's a lot of hell, death, and destruction in the Red Book, mentioned in the Red Book. Let's see if I can find it, but I wrote an article in 2013 called "There Will Be Blood." And basically, human beings don't change their attitudes until there's blood, unfortunately. And I wrote this article, "There Will Be Blood," which covers it actually. Oh, here it is. Okay, I actually had it on this sheet, so I can show it to you here. At least the key Jungian quotes, okay, that are, and this is the link. So I will put the link into the YouTube chat in just a moment. But there were 3 critical quotes that I used here, Jung quotes. One of them is, "You already feel the fist of the Iron One on your back. This is the beginning of the way. If blood, fire, and the cry of distress fill this world, then you will recognize yourself in your acts. Drink your fill of the bloody atrocities of war. Feast let's see, I'm sorry, I can't read it on the screen because my cataract's getting away. Feast upon the killing and destruction, then your eyes will open, you will see that you yourselves are the bearers of such fruit. You are on the way, if you will, all this. Willing creates blindness, and blindness leads to the way. Should we will error? You should not, but you do will that error which you take for the best truth, as man has always done. That was a quote from the Red Book. And then later on, he says, I saw something terrible and incomprehensible. I saw the peasant's boot, the sign of the horrors of the peasant war, of murdering incendiaries and of bloody cruelty. I knew to interpret this sign for myself as nothing but the fact that something bloody and dreadful lay before us. I saw the foot of a giant that crushed a whole city. How could I interpret this sign otherwise? I saw that the way to self-sacrifice began here. They will all become enraptured by these tremendous experiences, and in their blindness will want to understand them as outer events. It is an inner happening. May the frightfulness become so great that it can turn men's eyes inward so that their will no longer seeks the self in others, but in themselves. And Jung commented later on that on the first day of World War I, he had to make a passage from Aberdeen, Scotland, into Central Europe. And as he passed the railway stations on the way to Switzerland, people were euphoric. They were dancing in the streets about the coming of the war. And this is exactly what he was predicting about several months earlier, because this was a dream that he had before the beginning of World War I. And then he also says, the masses, as we know, follow the law of their own inertia and seek, if disturbed, to restore the state of balance as speedily as possible, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. And he said that in an essay, which was a commentary on Kaiserling's La Révolution Mondiale, which is in Civilization and Transition, volume 12, paragraph 498. And so the point is that we're bloody, awful creatures, actually, and that out there in society, there are people at all stages of development. Dr. Jung said that the range was about 10,000 years of people in different societies, but also in our own society, who are at different stages of development and understand things in different ways. And so we have to step into that society, that very complex society, and that's what the Gethsemane thing means. For Christ, it meant to go to the crucifixion, but for the rest of us, it means that we have to face being crucified for another 40 or 50 years or whatever it is. I think that's my interpretation of it. But
I think one thing that is encouraging that Edinger says is that as we digest our own evil, so does the evil in the collective get digested, so
right.
that those of us that are following this Jungian path, as we work with our shadow, to be serious about it, that we're actually helping the collective move into a better direction.
Yeah, and so I'm just putting on YouTube the link to my article, There Will Be Blood.
I think the psychological meaning of Gethsemane, there's a wonderful comment by Agnella Yaffe about Jung, that his that suffering enforces self-transformation. Joy is not a challenge that enforces self-transformation, and does so much more rarely. So she says suffering is a challenge that enforces self-transformation. Joy is not, and it does so much more rarely. So that is the, I think, the psychological image of Gethsemane, is that in order to transform, I mean, there's one other thing she says there, is that Jung followed the downward movement of life, for he felt that was always in keeping with the intrinsic truth of the moment. So he was always looking that you can't, you know, this is a truth of AA too, that you cannot be fully human unless you touch bottom. You know, in other words, that's where the negredo is. That's where the prima materia is. You have to start, if you're going to have a fresh start. You know, you had the salutio, where everything's the baptism, where everything is now fluid. Then you have the experience of Gethsemane, this experience of suffering, which now takes everything away from you. So you lose everything you have. So in other words, this is what the night sea journey does, is going under the depths, is that it breaks you, it dismembers you and chops you up into little pieces. And then you get reassembled and you come up on the outer side, reborn. So this is the beginning of the self-transformation. Suffering.
Right. I know numerous times in my life, I have had to say to myself, do I really have to do this? And is this the way? And that sort of thing. And that's the same question that Christ was asking in Gethsemane. And it's a question that we all have to face. It seems to me. Jerome, did you have a comment on that? Or any of the stuff about blood?
No, other than you have to come to realize that we all have that potential and that evil within us, and to take that projection back. But we still, when push comes to shove, you can do evil. You know?
Right, and often, and Christ was tempted in the desert shortly after he was baptized, obviously, and he was offered, a physical world kingdom in effect by the devil, and which is the power devil. He was offered power. He knew that he was making a difference in the people that were following him around and listening to his messages. And so he knew that that could be converted into temporal power. But if he had done that, then we wouldn't remember him any more than we would remember any other rabbi that lived 2,000 years ago. Yeah, likely. Or would he be remembered more than Spartacus? I don't know. Okay. Any other comments before we close for the evening? Because we've gone a half hour over, but we still do have folks listening on YouTube, which I appreciate. Okay, just a reminder for everybody that we will not be having a meeting tomorrow because it is my 30th wedding anniversary, and my wife made a reservation for this anniversary more than 30 years ago, and so I have to recognize the day.
Wow, that's pretty
congratulations.
Long. Yeah.
Thank
Bravo.
you. Bravo.
Have a great evening.
Yeah, have a happy anniversary too.
Right. So for those of you in the advanced group, I'll see you at 1:30 on Wednesday, Eastern Daylight Time, or Eastern Time, whether it's daylight or not. And if you are watching this video and you're interested in the advanced reading group, please write skip.conover@gmail.com and ask to join our advanced reading group. We have a lively group now.
Well, I'm glad we had a lot of people show up tonight.
Yeah, this has been a good group.
Yeah.
And last week, just so you know, we had more than 200 people watch last week's session overnight, and you know, we're up to 350 or so that have watched last week's session. And as we spread ideas around, I often think that if 300 people hear it directly, then those ideas may go out to about 10 people for every one that listens, because they spread out through the collective unconscious. People don't even realize it, and they spread things around. And so through one, it may get to 100, but through another, it might only get to one other person. But my estimate is 10 to 1. And that has proven pretty true over the last decade of my work on the internet. So
good.
So anyway, thank you so much for joining tonight, and we'll see you Wednesday for the panelists, and for the rest of you, I'll see you next week on Monday, when we'll try to continue with.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Take
Bye.
care now. Bye bye.
Okay.
Thanks,
Good night.
Nancy. Bye bye.
Bye.
Thanks.